Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are diving deep into this virus that's been causing a lot of concern over in China. It's called HMPV, human metapneumovirus. And I know what you're thinking, another one. But before you start running for the hills, let me just assure you that this isn't another COVID variant. It is a respiratory virus, though, and it causes infections with symptoms that look a lot like the flu, actually. It's been around for a while, but here's the thing. China's seen this surge in cases, and there are some, I don't know, almost like eerie parallels to the early days of COVID.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's not a new virus, but we're seeing it behave in new ways.
Yeah.
Especially now,
Yeah.
post-COVID. It's almost like the world is different and it's different too.
Right. So let's break it down. What does it actually feel like to have this HMPV? Imagine you wake up, you've got a cough, maybe a fever, some congestion,
The classic cold or flu symptoms, that's what we're talking about with HMPV. And you know that that's what makes it so tricky because it looks like so many other things. So you can't really tell just based on how you're feeling, whether it's HMPV or something else. You really need to have those lab tests to be sure. And that's why that early detection is so important, especially for you, because if you can catch it early, you can prevent it from, turning into something worse, like bronchitis or even pneumonia.
So it's like a chameleon almost. It blends in. So how does this sneaky little virus spread?
No surprises here. It spreads just like all those other respiratory viruses that we all know and love. Coughing, sneezing, close contact with someone who's sick, even touching surfaces that have the virus on them, and then touching your face.
Yeah.
It's the same playbook as COVID all over again.
Yeah, it sounds very familiar. So knowing how easily this thing spreads, let's talk about who is most vulnerable. Who should be extra careful?
I'm guessing you probably already know the answer to this one. It's the same folks who are vulnerable to a lot of these respiratory bugs. Young kids, older adults, and anyone with a weaker immune system. CDC has highlighted those groups as being, particularly vulnerable.
Okay, so we are seeing some parallels to COVID, at least in terms of, who is most at risk. So let's say you catch it. Is there anything you can do to treat it?
That's the thing. There's not a specific antiviral treatment for HMPV, not yet anyway, and there's no vaccine either. So treatment really focuses on just managing your symptoms, making sure you're comfortable, and preventing those complications, like the bronchitis and pneumonia that we talked about earlier, especially for those high-risk groups.
Got it. So no magic bullet. But supportive care is super important. Now I'm noticing some similarities to COVID. We've got flu-like symptoms. It spreads through respiratory droplets, and severe cases can even end up needing to go to the hospital. So are we looking at COVID 2.0 here?
No. HMPV is its own virus. It's distinct from COVID, but there is a connection.
Yeah, I'm intrigued.
What's really interesting? Researchers have found that after the lockdowns ended, when everyone started going out again, HMPV cases actually tripled in some regions.
Wait, so less exposure during the lockdowns actually led to more cases later? How does that even work?
Well, scientists think that because we were all so isolated, our immune systems kind of got out of practice. They weren't seeing as many viruses.
Right.
And they think that might have made us more susceptible.
That's like our immune systems get a little rusty.
Exactly. It's like they forgot how to fight off some of these common viruses.
Wow. So the COVID lockdowns might have actually paved the way for HMPV to come back with a vengeance. That's a little unsettling.
Yeah, it's definitely a theory that researchers are looking into.
Yeah.
It does raise some questions about the long-term impact of the pandemic on our immune systems.
For sure.
But there's the silver lining. The same things that we were doing to prevent COVID that work against HMPV too.
Okay, so we're talking washing our hands, avoiding touching our faces, staying away from people who are...
Exactly. And all that good stuff. It's not just about HMPV. It's about protecting yourself from all sorts of respiratory viruses.
Right. Good hygiene is always a good idea. So we've talked a lot about this rusty immune system idea, but let's dig a little deeper. What's the actual science behind it?
Well, let's shift gears a bit and look at some of the research. It's actually quite fascinating. I think you'll find it interesting.
Okay, let's do it.
This idea that our immune systems kind of went on vacation for a while during those lockdowns.
Yeah.
And now they're a little rusty. It's a really fascinating one. And you can kind of think about it. Our immune systems are always learning. They're adapting. They're encountering all these different pathogens all the time.
Right, so they need to be challenged regularly to stay in top shape.
Exactly. It's just like an athlete training.
Okay.
And, during the lockdowns, we were all social distancing, super hygienic. And that meant we just weren't exposed to as many pathogens as usual.
Right.
So it's like our immune systems kind of got a little bit of amnesia.
Immune amnesia.
Yeah, basically. It's like they forgot how to recognize and fight off some of those common viruses.
Like our friend HMPV.
Exactly.
Okay, so reduced exposure is definitely a leading theory.
For sure.
But are there other things that could be contributing to this?
Yeah. You know, it's a good question because it's probably not just one thing. There could be changes in the way the virus itself is behaving.
Right.
Maybe something's shifted there. Or it could be related to population demographics,
Mm.
the way people are moving around.
Mm.
Or even environmental factors could play a role.
So it's like this big puzzle with lots of different pieces.
Exactly. And researchers are still trying to figure out, how all those pieces fit together.
Right, it's a work in progress. So this whole rusty immune system thing, it is a bit concerning because it makes you wonder, are we more vulnerable to other viruses now, too?
Yeah. I mean, it's a valid concern.
Yeah.
And we're actually already seeing some evidence of that with other respiratory viruses making a comeback.
Oh.
Well, RSV, for example, had a really rough season last year.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of people were getting really sick.
So it's not just about HMPV, then.
Right.
Maybe it's this bigger shift, like our relationship with all these viruses has changed because of the pandemic.
I think that's a really interesting way to look at it.
Yeah.
It's like we're in this new world now,
Yeah.
and we have to figure out how to live with these viruses
Yeah.
in a way that we haven't had to before.
So are we going to see more of these familiar viruses making a comeback?
It's definitely a possibility.
Wow.
And that's why it's so important to stay informed
Yeah.
and to be proactive about our health.
Now, we've been focusing a lot on the potential downsides of this whole rusty immune system thing.
Right.
But are there any upsides? Like, could this period of reduced exposure have actually benefited our immune systems in some way?
That's a really interesting question. And, some experts believe that it could have given our immune systems a chance to kind of reset.
A reset?
Yeah, like a break.
Oh.
And they think that that might actually reduce the risk of things like autoimmune disorders
Oh, wow.
or even allergies.
So less exposure could potentially lead to a lower risk of those conditions.
That's the theory.
Mm.
But we need more research to know for sure.
So it's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Less exposure might make us more vulnerable to some viruses, but it could also have some positive effects in the long run.
Exactly. It's this complex interplay of factors.
Sure.
And we're still figuring out all the implications.
Right.
But, regardless of the long-term effects, I think we can all agree that staying informed about HMPV is crucial.
Absolutely.
And taking steps to protect ourselves.
Knowledge is power,
Oh,
right?
exactly.
So let's shift gears again and dive into some of the latest research on HMPV. What are scientists doing to try to combat this virus?
Well, one area that's really exciting is vaccine development.
Oh, yeah. Vaccines are always a hot topic.
For sure. And there are actually several promising candidates that are already in clinical trials.
Oh, wow. So they're moving quickly.
Yeah, they're really trying to get ahead of this one.
That's good news. What about treatments? Are there any new antivirals in the pipeline?
Yeah, there are a couple that have shown some promise in the lab.
Okay.
They've been effective against HMPV in those early studies. But they're still in clinical trials to see how they work in humans.
Right. Safety and effectiveness.
Exactly.
Fingers crossed those trials go well.
Me too.
But for now, we're still stuck with managing symptoms.
Right. Yeah, for the most part.
Okay.
But even in that area, with symptom management, there's some cool new things being explored.
Oh, like what?
Well, researchers are looking at monoclonal antibodies.
Monoclonal antibodies.
Yeah.
Those were used to treat COVID, right?
Exactly.
So they're these lab-made proteins that kind of mimic your immune system's response. And they target and neutralize specific viruses.
Exactly. And they've been really effective against other viral infections.
Right.
So scientists are thinking maybe they could work for HMPV too.
So they're basically trying to give our immune systems a boost.
Exactly.
It's like a targeted strike force against the virus.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool. It's amazing how these scientific advancements in one area can lead to breakthroughs in other areas.
It's true.
Like, who would have thought that something developed for COVID could potentially help us fight off HMPV?
It's really remarkable.
It is. Now, you mentioned earlier that HMPV was first identified in 2001.
Yeah,
That seems kind of recent in the world of viruses.
it is.
So why did it take so long to discover this virus?
That's a great question. And, the answer might be that it was hiding in plain sight.
Hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, because it often causes mild illnesses.
Okay.
It might have just been lumped in with all the other common cold viruses.
Oh, so it was just flying under the radar.
Exactly.
And then eventually, Scientists developed better tools to identify and study viruses.
Right.
And that's when they realized, hey, wait a minute, this is something different.
Exactly. And they named it HMPV.
So it was there all along,
It was.
just waiting to be discovered.
Exactly.
But now that we know about it,
we can start to figure it out, learn how it works, and develop ways to fight it.
right. And it sounds like we're already making progress on that front.
We are, with those vaccines and treatments in development.
That's good to hear. Now, before we move on, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier. The surge of HMPV cases in China.
Right.
Is this just a China problem? Or should the rest of the world be worried too?
Well, while the current surge is definitely centered in China, it's important to remember that HMPV is a global virus.
Oh.
It's found all over the world, and it's likely that we'll see cases increase in other regions as well.
So it's not really a question of if, but when we see those cases rise in other parts of the world. I mean, that's kind of unnerving, right?
Yeah, it's understandable to feel that way, but it's important to remember, this isn't a reason to panic. It's a reason to prepare. We have the knowledge, and we have the tools to manage this, just like we've managed other respiratory viruses before.
Okay, so no need to panic, but definitely stay vigilant.
Yeah.
And how can we prepare? What should people be doing?
Well, the same advice applies here. Practice good hygiene. Wash those hands. Stay informed about what's going on. And don't hesitate to reach out to your doctor if you have any concerns.
Okay, good advice. Now, before we wrap up our deep dive on HMPV, I want to touch on something we haven't really talked about yet. The long-term implications of this virus. What are the potential long-term effects of an HMPV infection?
That's a really great question. And it's one that researchers are still trying to figure out. Most people recover from HMPV without any lasting problems. But some studies have suggested that there might be a connection between HMPV infection and the development of things like asthma or other respiratory conditions later in life. But we need more research to really understand that connection.
So it's something to keep an eye on. Are there any specific groups that are more likely to experience those long-term effects?
Well, like with a lot of respiratory illnesses, young children, older adults, and people with weakened immune systems, they're generally at higher risk for complications. And that includes potential long-term effects.
Right, makes sense.
So it sounds like we're still learning about this virus, both in the short term and the long term.
That's true. But the good news is, there are a lot of scientists out there who are actively researching HMPV, and we're learning more all the time.
Okay, that's good. So where do we go from here? What's the main takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think the key message is this. HMPV is a virus that we need to pay attention to. It's not just a China problem, it's a global concern. But it's not a cause for panic. We just need to be smart, stay informed, practice good hygiene, and support the research that's being done. And if we do all those things, we can manage this challenge and protect ourselves and our communities.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the world of HMPV.
It's been a fascinating journey, hasn't it?
It really has. We've learned about its sneaky symptoms, its ability to spread so easily, and the potential impact of the pandemic on its resurgence. We've also talked about the latest research
on vaccines, treatments,
and the long-term effects of this virus. And I think the biggest takeaway is that knowledge is power when it comes to facing these viral threats. If we stay curious, ask questions, and seek out reliable information, we can make informed decisions about our health.
I totally agree. So to all our listeners out there, stay curious, stay informed, and as always, thanks for joining us for the deep dive. We'll see you next time.
For another deep dive into the fascinating world